Hey, how's it going, guys? This is your boy Hazzed, and today on the Battle for Azeroth beta, we're going to be taking care of one of the most asked questions, especially when heading into a new expansion, is which spec is better, Unholy or Frost, in terms of DPS. So in this video, we're going to go into a little bit more descriptive on where the strengths and weaknesses lie in both PvE and PvP situations between Frost and Unholy.
But it's alright, 'cause right now
starting off comparing these two specs, we have to take a look at Frost DK's AoE and Unholy DK's AoE. Now the thing with Frost DK is that it doesn't really matter which talents you take between Frost Scythe, Avalanche, Frozen Pulse, your AoE damage is still going to reside on generating a Howling Blast proc to deal the majority of your AoE pressure, unless you're using Breath of Sindragoza on a 2-minute cooldown, or Frostworm's Fury, which is, I'd say, the highest damaging AoE ability, at least when it comes to burst, in the entire game. That being said, Frost DK's AoE is good. It's not amazing in comparison to Unholy, but it's not terrible either. Now, I'd say Frost DK's AoE, when you're using Breath of Sindragoza, is going to deal quite a bit of DPS. We're talking about 30k to about 32k burst, and then it's going to slowly fall over time, allowing Frozen Pulse to take over for the majority of your AoE DPS pressure in the long run. So I'd say 32k is fairly good when it comes to multiple targets. At least when it comes to 4 targets, you're going to go ahead and pop up some of that pillar. You're going to go ahead and use your DPS trinkets or Remorseless Winter to obliterate, and at that point is where you go right into breath, and of course pop your empower. After you use one obliteration, you could use a Howling Blast to generate a little bit more AoE pressure. If you do that before then, you'll end up rune starved and not being able to deal your maximum amount of damage, and you just kind of spam those obliterates and using those big Howling Blast procs that you get to go ahead and keep your AoE and your single target pressure going on. Now, as you can see, my Frost DK DPS is going to start falling off at this point once breath falls off, and the majority of our damage at this point is going to rely on either a Howling Blast, Echoing Howl, which is Howling Blast, an ability that procs off of Howling Blast, and it starts relying more on melee damage and Frozen Pulses at this point, comparison to being more of the hard damage. Now, if I sit here on this DPS meter and just keep beating the crud out of it for a while, we'll drop down to, I'd say, roughly about 14k DPS consistency, and we really won't go much lower than that here on a Frost DK, just because that Frozen Pulse gives us kind of like a safety hatch that we're not going to fall below a certain portion. And of course, the more mobs there are, the better Frozen Pulse is going to be able to keep up your DPS. And as you can see there, as long as I keep myself rune starved, Frozen Pulse is actively going to be going off. As you can see, Frozen Pulse is now above my melee damage, and Frozen Pulse is slowly rising, and it's just going to keep rising up to the top 3 in elongated fights when it comes to AoE, even above Frost Fever, above Remorseless Winter, and we'll just go ahead and keep beating the crud out of these target dummies. So the reason Remorseless Winter did so much damage is I was using Gathering Storms. I could also generate the same amount of damage, or very close to the same amount of damage, using Glacial Advance, but I would be losing single target. And of course, Frostworm's Fury is going to give you a huge burst, which could probably proc up, at least on 4 targets, to about 50 to 60k DPS, which happens to be an insane amount of AoE damage for any class in the entire game. So let's go ahead and start. Yeah, that's something we want to say. Let's go ahead and take a look at Unholy DKs and kind of talk about how their unholy damage, or their unholy AoE damage, comes about. When it comes to AoEing on Unholy DK, you have to choose between a few different talents for the style that you like. You can take the Bursting Swords Pestilence build, which is going to give you a lot more burst when you're just kind of creating a giant Bursting Swords bomb, or you could take the Ebon Fever Epidemic build, which is going to give you a little bit less burst DPS, but quite a bit more consistency, kind of like, I'd say, closer to Frost DK's consistency. But we're going to stick with Bursting Swords Pestilence for today. So Unholy DKs are fairly nice. They are going to burst quite a bit harder than a Frost DK would, and I would say when it comes to large AoE and multiple target, their damage is going to amplify quite a bit better than a Frost DK's would. So that being said, we can clearly see which one of these two specs is going to end up being better on the consistency and of course overall AoE between these two specs, because right now Frost DK in comparison to Unholy DK is definitely lacking in the AoE category. So if we're going to say single target burst on this thing, we'll most likely hit about 40 to 50k DPS, which is quite a bit of AoE pressure for any class in the game. Unholy DKs surprisingly have some of the best AoE in the game. I guess it wouldn't be surprisingly, since they are supposed to be a multi-target dot class, so AoE is fairly expected within this class. So we're going to go ahead and throw up our Dark Transformation, use Unholy Frenzy, throw up any trinkets, and of course the Blood Racial, and we'll probably drop D&D pretty early, and generally we'll hit one Festering Strike, smack Apocalypse, and then going into the Burst Bomb, dealing as much AoE pressure as possible. Now we could Burst Bomb up front and get quite a bit of burst damage, a little bit more burst damage that way, but inevitably it's better to go in for the major damage than it is to just rely on the opener burst damage as Unholy. So what we're going to go ahead and do here is throw up our transformation. Well, we were going to throw up our transformation. Apparently didn't want to work there. Okay, we're throwing up our transformation, procking up our cooldowns, throwing down that, applying our dots. One hit, procking up Apocalypse, and from here on out we just go into Burst Bomb. I should have Burst Bombed off that. I would have done quite a bit more DPS, but that's okay. We hit about 40,000 just like I said we were going to, and then we just continue on with our normal rotation. Now what you can do is take Death and Decay, string it out a little more. You can use it up front. There's quite a bit of different things you can do as Unholy to make that deal a little bit more pressure. Now we're just gonna wait for of course our Death and Decay to come back up, and then we're just gonna continue on with what we were doing, dealing quite a bit of damage to every target out here. We do need to apply some wounds, which generally doesn't happen too often. As you can see here on the Unholy DK, we're keeping about 20,000 DPS at the moment. It'll fall a little farther, but you could see the overall DPS of Unholy is quite a bit stronger than it is as Frost. And as far as keeping up a consistency, Unholy is quite a bit better at doing that, especially when there comes multiple adds, just based on the fact that everything's dotted up. And when it comes down to just overall consistent damage, dotting each of the targets gonna deal quite a bit more damage than trying to sit there and melee them, especially when it comes to dodging mechanics and things along those lines. So when it comes to which class or which spec has better consistent AoE throughout dungeons or PvE situations, it's definitely going to go to Unholy. Now that being said, we're going to go ahead and start talking about some single target pressure. Starting out, we're going to be talking about some Frost DK single target pressure here. As for the level 56 talent, does come into play for the single target DPS, especially when it comes to single target burst. There is a little bit of differentiation going on between these talents. We got Icy Talons, which does now proc off of Breath of Sintracosa, increasing your melee attack speed. As we know, for single target, melee attack ends up being one of your highest damaging abilities, so Icy Talons really does come in handy in the long run using those talents. As for Cold Heart, that's going to be your best way to generate the largest amount of, let's say, now burst to get some peak burst. Let's say you want to blow somebody up in 1v1 PvP, something along those lines, or burst in the largest amount of burst in the smallest amount of CC time. That's also going to be the way to go. But as for overall DPS and single target PvE DPS, we're going to go ahead and break this down a little more. As for the level 60 talents, it's either going to be between Avalanche or Frozen Pulse for your overall damage. Frozen Pulse, again, is going to give you kind of that safe fall catcher to make it so your damage isn't reduced past a certain point, which is probably what's going to go with the elongated fight and single target. As far as 6-minute fights, 8-minute fights, Frozen Pulse is going to be the best out of those three. But if you're doing PvP situations, you want to generate the largest amount of burst damage on somebody, you're going to be taking some Avalanche. As for the level 90 talents, now this is where it gets kind of interesting. Gathering Storms is going to give you quite a bit of overall AoE consistency throughout the fight, and it's also going to generate a fairly amount of single target pressure. As for Glacial Advance, terrible in single target. Like, just throw that out the window. It's not really worth using when it comes to single target. Now, if there is a boss fight, let's say, that generates a large amount of adds throughout the fight, Glacial Advance could definitely proc back up to being a fairly good ability. But as for the other ability, Frostworm's Fury, as we know, it's one of the highest damaging AoE abilities in the game. It's also one of the strongest single target generators when it comes to burst in the smallest amount of time, especially if it crits. Now, this is where it kind of comes up to be a wild card for Frost DKs. Because Frostworm's Fury can put a Frost DK single target burst way above an Unholy DK single target burst. That being said, it could also make it just slightly stronger. So you're kind of like sacrificing a lot of DPS for a 3-minute cooldown that you're either gotta, kind of make a choice. Are you going to use this on trash or are you going to use this on a boss? Which determining what Mythic Plus scenarios you're going to be facing with this ability is going to kind of designate where you want to use it. And of course, how you go about pulling the dungeon also is going to kind of say how you're going to use an ability, something like this. But as for a 3-minute cooldown on it, I do find it fairly frustrating to use because I find myself making a choice between, do I use it on a boss or do I use it on trash? Because my AoE sucks without it, or it's going to completely bring down my single target DPS if I don't save it for the boss. Personally, I would have liked to seen Frostworm's Fury do like half the DPS and then be on like a 1.5 minute cooldown, kind of like an equivalent to an Unholy DK's Apocalypse. But we ended up getting the major burst that can almost one-shot people in 1v1 situations, and it's on a 3-minute cooldown, and it deals absolutely massive damage when it scales off of strength and of course attack power, increasing the damage by quite a bit. So you got to kind of make a decision what you want to do there inevitably for that single target pressure. I'll go ahead and take it just for the lulz to show you what kind of upfront burst it can do. And of course for the level 100 talents when it comes to single target pressure. Alright, so when it comes to the level 90 and the level 100 talent, if you want single target burst, it doesn't matter what other talents you choose. Your burst comes from either Frostworm's Fury or it comes from Breath of Sindragosa. Otherwise, your single target burst is going to be terrible. So if you're like a huge Obliteration fan, you're going to be forced to basically take Frostworm's Fury, so your single target DPS, and at that point, you're forced to use it on bosses because your single target DPS is going to be absolute garbage without Frostworm's Fury. That being said, if you don't like Obliteration and you're kind of like me and you like taking the Breath of Sindragosa talent, you're able to switch up these talents to a couple other things because you will have single target DPS that will keep up with other classes. Being that Breath of Sindragosa does make up for losing Frostworm's Fury. So you got to kind of think about that when you're playing a Frost DK. I would say that's one of the harder choices I've kind of had to distinguish between, but we will, just for the lulz, take Frostworm's Fury and Breath of Sindragosa and kind of show some maximum damage burst here. And since it's more designated, I'd say, for PvE situations, if you wanted PvP, you'd be taking that Cold Heart build and hitting that Icy Chains directly after throwing up your breath, freezing the target, stunning them if you're using the legendary chest piece, and of course you're probably like 110 to 114, so you can just absolutely global people. But outside of that, it's still the same principle. So you could throw up that Icy Chains just after breath, hit the target with some major burst, and then throw off Frostworm's Fury for a secondary major burst on the target, while of course Breath of Sindragosa is currently ticking. But I really like using my Icy Talents because that melee damage. Alright, so we're going to go in on the target. We're going to hit it with 2 Obliterates and burst kind of the same way we did with Breath. Frostworm's Fury I'm going to set in just after setting up my Breath of Sindragosa ability, just because it takes quite a bit of time to stack up 5 stacks of increased frost damage, and of course make sure we proc up our strength proc on our weapon, otherwise it is not going to hit very hard. Alright, so we're going to pre-proc, of course, Pillar of Frost. We're going to use any trinkets we have and 2 Obliterates, Breath of Sindragosa. Don't use Howling Blast procs until after setting up your Breath of Sindragosa, otherwise it's totally going to kill your opener. Like, you want to use it beforehand, like you feel like you should, because that's kind of, I'd say, second nature when it comes to Legion. You just want to get that up as fast as possible, but that is not the same when it comes to Battle for Azeroth and setting up Breath. Alright, so we're going to go ahead and pop it. Power, we're going to use our trinkets. We're going to pop Remorseless Winter, 2 Obliterates to set it up, and we're coming out with a big rest. We're going to go ahead and early pop in Power because holy crap is our runic power just being nuked right there. And we're going to come out with Big Dragon, putting our DPS at about 20,000. kind of underwhelming from what we usually can hit, because I didn't seem to get very many RP procs there on the single target pressure. And we're gonna go ahead and just finish up our DPS. Now the one thing you do notice is how fast Frost DK's DPS did fall from that inevitable burst. Now the one thing that Frost DKs definitely have when it comes to single target damage is consistency. Now our single target damage is only supposed to be flashy during major cooldowns. Outside of major cooldowns, it's definitely not the greatest, and our single target's gonna fall quite a bit. Now the nice thing about Frost DK DPS that I'd say a lot of people kind of underestimate is the overall single target consistency that we're gonna keep, because once you hit those, let's say 2 to 3 minute battles, you're definitely going to notice a huge difference in your overall DPS, especially compared to a lot of other classes, because Pillar of Frost is on a 45-second cooldown. Being as a 45-second cooldown, for the most of the time, you're going to have Pillar of Frost up. Same with Empowered Rune Weapon and World PvP, it's only on a 1-minute cooldown. When it comes to, let's say, doing dungeons or something along that line, it will be on a 2-minute cooldown, elongated out your damage a little more. That being said, Frost DKs can hold out a bit more consistency pressure than Unholy DKs can, but we're going to go ahead and start digesting a little bit of that Unholy DK single target pressure, so you can get kind of a feeling or idea of what's going on over there. When it comes to Unholy DK single target pressure, in my opinion, I do like to take Ebon Fever, I like to take Will to Serve, and bada bing bada boom, this is what I like to take. Inevitably, it ends up being a fairly good single target burst rotation, but we'll stick with Infected Claws just because I want to grant me a little bit more single target burst up front, and yeah, deal damage from there. So our setup is fairly the same. I'd have to say you could take out Death and DK out of the rotation, but I will use it just for the simple fact that I want to apply as much Festering Wounds as possible to hopefully grant an Apocalypse within the first attack of Festering Strike, giving us quite a bit of single target pressure. Now in Holy DKs on average, it will burst, if I'm using Breath of Sindragosa on the Frost DK, it'll burst about 4,000 to 5,000 DPS less. But in terms of not having Breath of Sindragosa up, I'd say Frost and Unholy have a fairly similar single target DPS pattern as far as damage goes. Now in Holy DKs, we're gonna come in on the target. We're gonna pre-proc up our transformation. We're gonna use our little cooldown there, proc up those, drop down our D&D, apply the dots, and of course coming off with the opener Apocalypse, dumping as much runic power as we can into the target for single target pressure, and just doing as much DPS as possible from there. Now in Holy DK procced up to about 15k going on there. We did not use Army of the Dead, which that would have helped our DPS by quite a bit. We may have actually hit 18 to 20k with Army of the Dead up. Now the major issue, as you just saw with Unholy DKs, is definitely going to come down when it's single target, to the fact that the majority of your major single target burst damage is going to come from Army of the Dead, which is on a 8-minute cooldown timer, an 8-minute cooldown timer. That is just going to absolutely destroy an Unholy DK single target DPS after, let's say, the first boss. Now, being that it's on an 8-minute cooldown timer, the chances are you're going to have it for, let's say, the first boss of a dungeon and roughly the last boss of a dungeon. So when we look at these two things, when it comes to Unholy versus Frost, when it comes to single target pressure, when it comes to 1v1 or duel situations, Frost DK is definitely going to take the cake when it comes to generating the largest amount of now burst. But being as it may, Unholy DKs, when it comes to, let's say, 1v1 or duel scenarios, is going to have the advantage when it comes to range pressure, dealing with ranged mobs such as hunters and mages. But when it comes down to, let's say, an Unholy DK versus a Frost DK in the 1v1 category, a Frost DK is definitely going to win just based on the pure amount of burst they can generate and the speed that they can generate their damage in comparison to how long it takes for Unholy DKs to generate the majority of their damage. And of course, being that it takes Army of the Dead for Unholy DKs to burst as close as Frost DKs, not nearly as quick, I might add. it's definitely going to make an Unholy DK outside of that Army of the Dead major burst cooldown deal a lot less single target pressure and a lot less single target burst as a Frost DK would. So that brings us to kind of, I'd say a pretty good conclusion about which one of these specs is better in the single target category. It's actually fairly hard to say when it comes to single target category, and I do actually hate saying that just because I know people would like kind of a conclusion or a solid answer on that, but I would actually have to give it to Frost DKs just for the simple fact that I know a Frost DK is going to have a 16 to 17k burst on every boss fight. Even if they are using Breath of Sindragosa, they could be proccing it up to about 20 to 24k every fight if they wanted to, but that would also lower their single target pressure. So Frost DKs, when it comes to single target pressure and single target burst, also have a little bit better single target consistency than Unholy does. So I'm going to have to give the single target pressure to Frost, and of course, as we saw in the previous thing, the best AoE is going to go to Unholy. So let's break into a little bit more, let's say, PvP scenario orientated, and of course a little bit of survivability. So breaking into more of PvP scenarios, we have to take a look at major single target burst damage and of course survivability in multiple situations. Now, as for the level 56 talent, we decided we're going to use Cold Heart, and of course for maximum damage, Avalanche, and of course Frostworm's Fury and Breath of Sindragosa if we're just going to be maximizing that burst damage within that small amount of window. And of course you could take Gathering Storms if you don't want to completely rely on a 3-minute cooldown. Breath of Sindragosa relies again on a 2-minute cooldown, while Empower in PvP, as long as you're spec'd into it with Overpowered Rune Weapon, is going to be on a 1-minute cooldown. And of course Pillar of Frost is on a 45-second cooldown. Fairly good setup I'd have to say for PvE when it comes to single target burst, because you are going to be able to get a very large amount of damage out of a very small time. And as far as, of course, Frost versus Unholy, an Unholy's Kryptonite is going to be Pure Burst. A Pure Burst that's going to be able to force the Unholy DK to play defensive instead of playing offensive in a 1v1 situation, causing him to use self-healing capabilities instead of dumping his runic power into dealing more damage. That's going to be kind of how Frost DKs will take the cake in 1v1 scenario. That being said, I'd say survivability wing of where Frost DKs are going to be coming ahead is the fact that Unholy DKs and Frost DKs at this point in Battle for Azeroth have literally the same defensive cooldowns. Unholy DKs no longer have Pet Shield, so they also have to rely on Death Pact and of course Breath of Sindragosa. When you force somebody in, I'd say, Battle for Azeroth to play defensive, you're also forcing them to use global cooldowns that they are not using to play offensively while you're going full aggressive. So under that logic, if you had a very good Unholy DK that had a complete plan to peel off the Frost DK instead of applying upfront burst damage, it would definitely play out a bit better. But I'd have to say a really good Frost DK is not going to allow that to happen. The move is going to be made so far in the amount of damage the Frost DK is going to deal with the current strength of Frost DKs. They can eat right through anti-magic shells, which is going to be kind of the saving grace for Unholy. That being said, I'd have to say when it comes to 1v1 scenarios, for the most part, Frost DKs are going to be better than Unholy DKs, just for the amount of burst. Let's say DK versus Fury Warrior. Frost DK is going to stand a much better chance in that scenario, just based on the amount of burst a Fury Warrior can deal up close and in your face. They can end a duel in 5 to 7 seconds. So if an Unholy DK can't peel the warrior off of himself, it's going to end very badly for the Unholy DK, while the Frost can definitely have a better option or a better chance of winning the 1v1 fight standing toe-to-toe, especially since Frost DKs have Asphyxiate back. But that being said, Unholy DK does have a little bit more mechanical uses in the 1v1 situations in comparison to Frost, which is purely damage, and of course we got a little bit of stun and a little bit of healing back. And the mechanical uses I'm talking about with Unholy DKs is going to be coming from running something like Clawing Shadows, Ebon Fever, and Yeah, I'd say roughly those abilities right there. Maybe Summon Gargoyle if you really wanted to go in on it. But since we don't have very much haste, Unholy Frenzy with that 20% haste increase does quite a bit when it comes to that burst. But since we want to be, let's say, DPSing on a ranged target instead, Summon Gargoyle is going to be a bit more effective. Since you will, let's say, on a Unholy DK, which I do find Infected Claws and Clawing Shadows very odd that they're on the same talent row. But being as an Unholy DK kind of wants to start out at range, he may only want to come in, let's say, he's going to proc Gnaw on a target, so it's going to stun the target. Let's hope that the target trinkets, because if they don't trinket, the Unholy DK is going to basically be, in other words, in a lot of trouble. Alright, so let's say open up on a target, and of course you're DPSing on a target. You're going to set up some of your damage on the target. You're going to proc up a couple abilities. You're going to smack Summon Gargoyle. And then at this point, we're going to be spamming chains. And of course, anytime they close the gap on you, you're going to be using your healing capabilities, things along those lines. And of course, either be using Necrotic Strikes if there's self-survivability or things along those lines. Now, with the strength of Necrotic Strike, I'd have to say Unholy DKs are probably going to end up being better when paired with a healer inside of battle for Azeroth, while Frost DKs in a situation where it's DPS versus DPS can definitely see Frost DKs ending up being better under that category. Now, if it was, let's say, an Unholy DK versus Hunter or Unholy DK versus Mage, I'd say the Unholy DK has a bit better or a bit more of an upper hand compared to a Frost DK in that 1v1 category. But overall, after dissecting these things, finding out, I'd say Rated Arena Unholy DK most likely is going to be better, just for the fact that it doesn't rely nearly as much on 2-minute cooldowns, which of course lines up with Trinket and a lot of other major cooldowns. It relies on a 1.5-minute cooldown for some of its major bursts, and of course it has a little bit more, I'd say, mechanical stability instead of relying on just raw damage that can be mitigated. That being said, we don't know how effective the raw damage of Frost DKs is going to be inside of, let's say, 3v3 healer situations inside of Arena, because we haven't got to do very much PvP testing, and has been very limited to, let's say, simple battlegrounds. If you're lucky enough, you pray you might get a battleground, and of course 1v1 dueling situations. So overall, which class would I suggest to play inside PvP situations? If you want to survive, duel people, things along those lines, or play double DPS, I would suggest Frost. Now, if you want to play healer DPS in some kind of arena situations, I'd say Unholy more than likely is going to be better suited, since it has an extra interrupt and an extra stun, which inside of arena situations, mechanical generally ends up being the stronger way to play inside PvP situations. So you kind of got to make a choice for yourself under that logic. Do you want that opener front burst DPS that allows you to duel, or do you want to go inside arena, get some rating, play with the healer? It's completely up to you at this point. But I kind of wanted to make this video and let people know where we're at on DKs, because I know I'm going to be getting this question a ton. Like a ton. It comes in all the time. Which is better? Should I play Frost or Unholy? Well, just decide which style or play style you want to be playing as a Frost DK or an Unholy DK, and really just kind of find out what suits you. Do you want that upfront burst? Do you want to duel people? Are you going to be focusing more on Arena? Are you going to be focusing more on Mythic Plus? You decide. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Leave a like, leave some comments down below if you have any questions or something you'd like to input between this discussion. I'd like to hear what you guys got to say. And until next time, this was your boy Hazzed.